Welcome again to our program, Women to Women. It's nice to have you with us. Our sponsors are Carpenter Nevada LLC, importer of fine Portuguese olive oil, balsamic vinegar, and international teas, as well as Vilbas Deli Cafe, home of Pete's famous homemade chorizo. And you may notice something a little bit different this evening. I'm on the other side. I have with me tonight Carol Howell, who's going to be doing an interview of me. Normally your host is Carol Paz, but tonight Carol has graciously consented to come on. I've had a lot of people since the program has been on the air saying, Carol, you interview women, but what about yourself? Let's do an interview on you. So how can I say no? Okay. So Carol, thank you so much for taking on this responsibility. Carol is our host for the evening, and we're both named Carol, so stay alert. Okay, here we go.
Well, they can't forget our names,
No,
can
they can't. They can't.
Thank you. It's quite an honor to be asked to do this.
Well, thank you so much.
You've had just a dynamite start to your show. And I'm one of those that thought all of the interesting people you have, I know you to be a very well-educated, very world traveler. And there's so much more to your story that I think it will fascinate people. So it's my honor. Thank you for asking me.
Where should we begin? What do you think?
Beginning.
In the beginning.
Our families, our parents start the shaping of our lives.
They certainly do.
So let's start with your parents. Tell us a little bit about them.
Well, I come from a very small town at that time in northwest Ohio called Wauseon, Ohio. And I grew up with a much older brother who was really a personality that I didn't get to know until much, much later in my life. He was 12 years older than myself, and my mother had 6 children altogether, but 3 of us survived and 3 did not. So my sister and I are just 14 months apart. And I have to say that our parents, both of whom are of Scottish descent, very strong characters, very strong personalities, strong work ethic in our family, but above all, lots and lots of love. So I grew up as a very happy little girl. And I can remember one time when I was probably 6 or 7, we lived in a large home, and we had a driveway that had 2 narrow strips of cement going from the front of our home back to our garage. And in between was all this precious grass that my father kept manicured, watered, and nobody was to ever go off of those 2 straight cement strips with a car. So at 6 or 7, it was my delight to take the garden hose and to just water all that central grassy area and to make mud pies. And my father came out of the house, out of the back door one summer's day and said, Carol Ann, what are you doing in the middle of my driveway? And I announced, I'm making mud pies and mud cookies. How many do you want? He said, aren't you ever going to grow up? And I said, no, I'm going to be a kid all my life. I like this life. He said, someday, Carol Ann, you'll recognize that you do have to grow up and that there are responsibilities in life. But he said, I'll take one of your cookies. And that was my father. He was the main voice in our home. And I grew up recognizing that my father was, he loved my mother very much. And I would see them often embracing. I would see my father occasionally kissing my mother. And, you know, we used to kid them about it. But on the other hand, it really established for me as a young person that there was a closeness in our family. It was an extended family. I had lots of aunts and uncles, cousins. They all came to our home for Thanksgivings and for Christmases because there was room. And we ran up and down the stairs. We ate, we played cards, and I think, like you say, Carol, our first teachers are our parents, and I had a very positive childhood in that respect. So it was unusual for me to make a decision that after I graduated from high school, that I would pick a school that probably was a lot bigger than I ever anticipated, and that was Ohio State University. I came from a graduating class of 96 students into a university of 57,000 on campus. So it was a completely different world. But as you say, the impact that my parents had on my thinking, my mother was a well-educated woman. She was one of those few women who had had a college degree. There was no money from her parents, from her Scottish parents, to pay for that education, but she and her younger brother helped each other through dental school and then through my mother's education, which was to become a teacher. And in that way, she had the support of her father, she had the support of her mother to further her education, and my mother passed that on to both my sister Karma and myself. So I believe that education is a very important aspect of who I am today, not because it has made me better than anybody else, no, but because it's broadened my thinking, it's broadened my horizons. And when we remain, and that was one goal I had, and my father had a hard time understanding this, that when I graduated from Ohio State, I intended not to go back to Wauseon to live. But I wound up by going back there anyway.
Is that right?
It is. I went back and I lived with my parents for 2 years as I taught school. And I was engaged to be married to a young Iranian student who was an architecture student. And again, they said, what have we done wrong? Both you and your sister are marrying immigrants. You're marrying non-Americans. They have student visas. What was wrong with an American man, Carol? And there's not a thing wrong with American men. It's just that this young Iranian student who is very intelligent, well-mannered, well-dressed, intrigued me. And I have a sense of adventure that I found out I didn't know I had as a kid.
So there was no fear of leading a whole different life with a foreign student, somebody other than an American, because you must have realized that you were going to be going back to his country.
Eventually, that was a possibility. And eventually, it would be a separation, long periods of separation from my country, from my family, from my extended family that I had always grown up with. But when I went to Ohio State, I went with the intention of becoming a doctor. So I enrolled in the pre-medical program, and I stayed with it until my junior year, until my future husband, that I didn't know was going to be my husband at that point, said, Carol, you're meant to be a teacher. And all these science courses, all these biology, anatomy, physiology, all of these things you can teach as a teacher if you decide to do that. And that made me really mad. I had spent all my Saturdays at Ohio State, instead of going to the Ohio State football games, in chemistry labs and anatomy labs, finishing my assignments. But ultimately, his name was Farouk. He was correct. And I graduated from Ohio State with a degree in sciences and with a degree in education and with a degree in languages. Because at that time, you needed to have foreign language, and I selected French. And so that put me in a position of having to think carefully. Here's a young Iranian student who was really pursuing me in terms of marriage material, and all of my friends at Ohio State, and including my parents, said, what are you thinking of, Carol? What are you doing? And my friends at Ohio State would say, you know, the only reason they want to marry an American woman is to have a green card, is to eventually,
Obtain citizenship.
Obtain citizenship. And I thought, well, what is so wrong with that if the character of the person is strong, is straightforward? And Farouk was all of that and more.
Now, we're talking at a time where there was a different Iran than what we know today.
Very much so.
So there wasn't the fear factor,
No.
I'm sure, of going to Iran.
No. My mother would take out the National Geographic magazines that she had stored up in our kitchen closet, and she would get those maps, those famous maps out of the National Geographic, stretch it across the kitchen table, and she said, have you any idea what the border between Iran and Russia is like? I said, I think it's 1,500 miles. She said, and more, and more. Do you know how, and at that time, in the 1960s, there was the Cold War between Russia and the United States. So there was a fear on the part of my parents that if I moved to Tehran, if I moved to the country of Iran, that ultimately I would have to deal in some way, some fashion, with communism, with Russians. And I said to my parents, as I came to understand my future husband's background more and more, they were Russian. They came out of the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution into what was then known as Persia, in order to escape what was happening to Tsar Nicholas, who at that time was Tsar of Russia, and Farouk's parents, especially his father and his uncles, were all businessmen with the Tsar of Russia, with Nicholas. So they did not fear Russia. They did business with Russia. But once the Bolsheviks came, the world changed.
And how did your future in-laws feel about an American woman coming home to be their daughter-in-law?
Very, very unhappy. They wanted their son, who was under contract, written contract, to marry his first cousin when she became of age. That was the planned pathway for that oldest son of theirs. When he came to the States, it was with a lot of concern, because Iranian parents, Persian parents, don't allow their daughters or their sons to usually go to a Western country, whether it's France, Germany, England, America, Canada. They just don't allow their children to not go with them. They would accompany their children so they can have the same foods, have the same language, have the same culture while they're all living in a foreign space. So I was not a popular choice. I was not the first cousin.
And how long did it take you to fit in?
Oh my goodness. Well,
I should say, did you fit in? And how long did that take?
You know, I had a marriage which was performed in Ohio, in my church, my home church, which was Christian. And Farouk insisted that we be married in my church. He had been brought up to be Islam, but he did not believe in Islam per se. He believed in God. He knew God existed. He didn't know who Jesus Christ was, and he was curious about that. Then we had a honeymoon on the East Coast, and I was asked to again be married officially in the mosque on West Riverside Drive in New York City, which I did. And a dowry has to be brought. And my dowry was the engagement ring. So in other words, in a Persian marriage, in an Iranian marriage, in a Middle Eastern marriage, if there is divorce, they want to make sure that the woman, the daughter, is left with enough that she can take care of herself. Because in that country at that time, a divorced woman would very likely never remarry. No one would want to remarry her.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But I did not marry Farouk based upon that. I married him in the eyes of God. I married him because I loved him dearly. And I married him for all the qualities that he had. He was intelligent, highly motivated to do well. He was a very loving person, a very giving person. And I absolutely knew he would make a strong father figure, just as my father had been strong in the development of my childhood. I knew that in time, given time, all things are possible through God, and that his mother, his father, his sisters, his brother would all come to know me. But it was a challenge, and the biggest challenge was moving into a 14th century country. And I'll explain that when we come back in the second half. Don't go away.
Are you looking for a healthier lifestyle? A more nutritious diet? Do you care about quality? If your answer is yes, or if you are just curious, come into Villa Basque Deli and Cafe right here in Carson City, Nevada. Discover fine Portuguese extra virgin olive oils, vintage balsamic vinegars, and a wide assortment of international health teas provided by distributor Carpa Nevada LLC. In addition to these terrific items, Villa Basque is also the home of Pete's famous Basque chorizo, handmade on the premises from Pete's secret family recipe. Satisfy your culinary curiosities. Don't delay.
How was school today?
Cool, we learned what to do in case there's an emergency.
Oh, will you show me?
If there is an earthquake, then you get under your desk, duck, cover, and hold. And when the shaking stops,
we evacuate the school just like a fire drill.
I'm glad you both know what to do in case of an emergency, but I'd still be worried.
check the phone, radio, or TV, and they'll tell you what to do.
Make a plan.
Assemble a kit.
Stay informed.
And be ready.
If a wildland fire is threatening your neighborhood, good access is essential for fast arrival of emergency responders.
Address numbers should be reflective and at least 4 inches tall.
Also, if your home or community has an electric gate, make sure your local fire department has key access or click to enter.
Remove flammable vegetation and overhead obstructions from your driveway. Allow 13.5 feet of vertical clearance and 10 feet on both sides.
Working together.
Visit livingwithfire.info for more tips to save your home.
Pets of the Homeless is a non-profit, all-volunteer organization that provides pet food and veterinary care to the homeless and less fortunate in local communities.
With donations from the public, we're able to provide homeless shelters with crates, bowls, cleaning materials, so that homeless with pets can come into homeless shelters and get the services that they need to get out of homelessness.
Welcome back to Women to Women. I'm Carol Howell, and we've switched places this evening or this afternoon with Carol Paz and learning something about Woman to Woman's hostess. Carol, when we broke, you were just telling us what a different world you were marrying into and getting ready to start. You want to pick it up from there?
Okay. Well, Farouk and I were married in 1968. And he decided to take me over to Tehran, Iran, the capital, to see what my take would be. And he did not tell me one single thing about what to expect, who to see. So when we arrived, finally, at that time it was 33 hours of flight.
Whoa.
Long time. And I had never flown outside of the United States prior to this marriage. So when we arrived in Tehran, the temperature was 125 degrees. When they opened that plane door,
wow.
I thought it was an oven. They could have been baking bread. It was that hot. And it was at night when you would have expected cooler temperatures. Well, we went into Mehrabad Airport, and we finally go all through customs and all the security check. And this was during the time of the Shah of Iran, the king. So there was no real turmoil at the airports. And I did not realize, but it's tradition for all of the family to come to the airport to greet you with flowers, with chocolates, which is a wonderful tradition. I also did not understand that there were 2 cars to carry 18 people back to Mom and Papa's house. So I thought for sure Farouk would call a taxi and he and I would go by taxi. They piled all 18 of us, 9 per car. You're sitting on people's laps, you're squashed together, and that's how we went. I was way in the back of a car, up against the side of the door. I was car sick, I was nauseous, I had a headache from the heat, and I thought to myself, please, Lord, just don't let me get to the point where I'm going to have a real problem back here. So we arrive at the home, and this is going to be our place to stay during this visit. And again, I did not understand that it's tradition to have all of the people come up to your new place, to have food, to have chai, to have tea, and to have pastries. And they stayed until 4 a.m. in the morning.
And nothing melted in that kind of heat?
Except my patience.
You.
Except my patience. I realized that I was walking back into a civilization that had so much more time involved in its creation than the United States of America. I understood that English was not going to be the language that anyone communicated with me in. I understood that the way I dressed as an American woman was unacceptable in a Middle Eastern country.
So you wore the veil and the costume and...
No, I did not wear the veil because I was not living there at that time permanently. I would go back in another couple of years to live on a permanent basis. But what I had to make sure was that from my neck down to my wrists, down to my ankles, that I was covered. And at that time, pantsuits were very popular. So I wore pantsuits every day, even in the heat. And I also realized that I would never be able to drive. I would need to have a chauffeur. I did not know at the time that I had married into a very well-established business family. I began to understand that the Shah and the Shah's family lived on the same street. where we were going to live. So I understood that security was going to be very tight on the little couche, the little road that my husband and I would be living on for this brief period of time. And I also understood that most of my time would be spent with my mother and father-in-law and the family. There would be no privacy, as I thought privacy between a young married couple would be. You just don't do that. You just share your life and share your love and share your time with everybody. So it was pretty overwhelming. And when they entertain starting with 25 to 30, up to 180, 200 people at a meal. Usually it takes place during the evening, in the outdoor patios, in the outdoor courts. And it was a very luxurious and a very different kind of life than I had been brought up as a child. As a child, I had been taught we don't waste food. If my parents had money, I never knew that. I just knew I was loved. Here, it was a very ostentatious, very showy life. And it was expensive gowns, Parisian gowns, Italian gowns. It was expensive tuxedos. Help was all over the house. Food, the tables were laden with food. And for me, I was concerned about, after all this gathering, where was all this food going to go? But the Persians are very generous people, very big-hearted, and all that food was given to all the neighborhood, all the servant families, everyone. Nothing was left for waste. And that made me feel much better. But that 6 weeks visit began to show me that I had a whole new way of life that I needed to prepare for. I was going to be the alien. I was going to be the guest in their country. I was going to be the minority. And it was my job as the wife of an Iranian husband to make sure that my Persian family felt very comfortable in my home at all times, that they were my guests in my home, and the very best would be served to them that I had to give. And I would need to learn the Persian language. Their conversations go on for 6 and 7 hours.
Oh my goodness.
In the same room with umpteen cups, small cups of chai, of tea. So I had to get used to drinking a lot of tea, which I enjoyed because they make it in such a delightful way. But I realized that in order for them to accept me as a part of the family, they had to trust me. And Persians wear a mask. You really don't know what they're thinking about you or about the situation. They don't reveal that through facial features. They're extremely cordial. They're extremely generous. They're very knowledgeable people. They're highly intelligent, especially in mathematics and in science and literature and in poetry and in music. And all of that was waiting for me to learn. And I needed to learn it because that's who they are. They were not coming to live in the United States. I was coming to live in the Middle East.
And you had to conform.
I needed to conform. And the first thing they wanted to do with me, because I was blonde, light-eyed, was to take me to a makeup artist. And they took me. They re-dyed my hair. I'm in shock. They put on dark makeup, dark lipstick, and we were getting ready to go to a function, to a gathering, a family gathering. When I looked in the mirror, I did not recognize who that was. And my husband said from behind in English to me, "Do you like it? Mama paid for it." And I just broke down. I said, "No, I don't like it. It's not me." And Mama looked at me, angry. She had spent all of this Persian toman, Persian dollars, to have this transformation to make me into a Persian woman, to please the family, to please her, to please my husband. And I was a disaster. I was crying, the makeup was running, and Farouk said, "Mama John." Mama John means Mama dear. "Let me handle Carol." And I understood enough Farsi at that time to realize the conversation that was going on. And I said, "I'm not going like this. He has to take all this color out of my hair, wash my face, let me start over. Let me do my own makeup." And that's exactly what happened. And when I arrived that night, I had on a beautiful dress that had been handmade for me, but I had on just my natural makeup, which isn't very much, and just my natural coloring. And Mama said, "Vay, what an embarrassment." But my husband said, "Carol, think of this. They're having to adjust to you, just like you are to them. It's going to take time. Just be yourself, and they will learn to love you for who you are." And that was my greatest fear, is not being accepted for who I am, for what I am. And I also understood that who I was not really what God had intended for me to be all along. He wanted me to grow. He wanted me to have an outreach program, a mission program. And my Persian family literally became for me the work of art in my life, because they helped me. They developed me. They grew me up in so many ways that had I not had Mama's training, Mama's cooking, Mama's time spent. One time she came to my home, this is after we moved there, and she lifted up this lid of whatever it was I was cooking, and she said, "You're going to kill my son.
Oh,
He's my favorite child." And I said, "Mama, I'm cooking soup." "Ay, vay, you don't know how to cook at all." So that began the lessons of cooking in her home, watching everything she did, how she did it, how many things she used, and I had to write everything down. But that cookbook, that homemade cookbook that I have, which I call Mama's Warnings, I still have today, and I use it. And if you ask me to fix a hamburger or a steak or a pork chop, I can't do it. I'm a Persian cook. And fortunately, during the time that we were living in Tehran, our little boy, whose name is Kamran, grew up. He spoke Farsi, he spoke Turkish. He helped me. He was a little bridge between myself and his grandparents, because he understood everything they were saying. And he would come to his mommy and say, "Mommy, Mama John wants some water. Can you fix her some water?" I said, "Of course I can." "Mommy, Mama John wants some tea. Can you fix her some tea?" "Of course I can." He was the superhuman little person who attended a day school with me as a teacher of English and of French. But without Kamran, without this little child, he made a path for me into the hearts of my family that otherwise would not have been there.
So you went for 6 weeks, came back to the United States.
Continued with my teaching job, and then the call came. Iran was booming. The Shah wanted everyone in the way of architects, constructionists, anyone who could help deal with all the construction that was going on. And Farouk was perfect. They hired him on the spot. And so I went originally 3 years after our marriage, and then 5 years after our marriage, I went to live on a permanent basis.
And that's where your son was born.
I came back to the United States to have my son born in the United States so that he would be an American citizen. All papers would be from the United States. And then I took him back when he was a year old. I continued to live with him in the States for about the next 4 to 5 months. Then his father came back to the States when he was a year old, and we had been separated for quite a long time. And we all went as a family back to Tehran to live. And I know that because our time is running short, the revolution, the Iranian Revolution of 1979, changed all of our lives and all of our plans forever after. And we'll take that up in another program.
As it did many. I have another friend that was married to one of the nephews of the Shah. So I've talked with her extensively about the revolution and what happened with it and her life that she spent. So
yes.
Fascinating. I knew you were going to be fascinating.
So I want to say thank you, Carol, for taking on this hostessing
you're quite
responsibility tonight, and I invite you to come back and to finish the interview.
I would love to. Next time I'll have my hat.
All right. And meanwhile, we want to thank our sponsors, Carpa Nevada LLC and Villa Bastelling Cafe, home of Pete's famous chorizo. And until the next time we meet, have a good evening. Thank you.